you are leading an employee network that is either a Jewish employee resource group or maybe a Muslim employee network or an Arab employee network, then this video is for you. Or potentially a multicultural network if you're here in the UK or one of the countries that tends to organise its employee networks in that way. I'm going to be talking about the very tricky topic of how you navigate discussions around Israel and Gaza. I'm recording this, it's August 2025, so that's the context. So how do you navigate these difficult discussions? This is what we're going to be getting into today. Friends, this is ERG strategy. I haven't been recording here for a little while. I've had all sorts of editor issues, that's for another day. But this is the channel that gives you the strategy, tips and tools to help you build engaged communities and employee networks and employee resource groups that have impact. Okay, so this particular topic, if any of you watch my LinkedIn lives, you will know that I did a LinkedIn live recently where I was talking about the challenge of getting into what some people call, political conversations. And we know that generally, a lot of people steer away from politics with good reason. And a lot of us have been brought up and raised to, for example, not talk about politics at the dinner table, right? And we sometimes bring that same philosophy into work in terms of let's just avoid politics because it's too easy for people to fall out. And I totally get that. I kind of agree. It is actually quite easy to fall out when you get into political conversations. But the reality is, in this here 2025, certainly from many of the groups that are represented by employee resource groups, you can almost not, you can't avoid it, right? You can't kind of like exist without talking about politics if you are there to support your members and to talk about things that are important to your members. You can't avoid politics, and that's why I'm doing a bit of a mini series. This is the first of 3 for specific employee resources who I know are kind of like in the middle of some quite tricky political discussions. And so that's what I wanted to do here. Basically, I wanted to bring these to the forefront and maybe give you some tips that will help you navigate these discussions. So without further ado, let's get into Israel and Gaza. Let me caveat this by saying I am not a historical scholar. In fact, I didn't even do history at GCSE, so I did history for 2 years, at the ages of like 11, 12, and 13, 3 years. And then I did not even take it as an option. So I'm no historical scholar. I have done quite a lot of delving into the history of the Middle East, especially as it pertains to Israel, especially when this conflict first happened. So on October the 7th, I did even more digging than I'd done previously because I really wanted to understand what was going on and what the historical context was. And the first thing I would say, actually, in terms of my first tip, if you are leading one of those networks, then make sure that you do some of that digging just so that you are really well informed. And in terms of the advice that I've got for you here, a lot of this is around becoming more informed as an ERG leader in terms of just understanding all of the context so that you understand where different individuals are coming at when it comes to this topic, right? So what I'm going to talk through is what are the key points of disagreement around Israel and Gaza? What is it that gets people so angry? Apart from the realities of what's going on the ground, why is it that people get quite tense around the topic and actually quite avoid it? So, for example, why is it generally I don't want to say it's banned on LinkedIn, but certainly they're not big fans of it, right? So why is it? What are the sticking points? How and where can you find common ground? So if, for example, this topic is becoming a bit of an issue for you as a network, or there are conversations that you're having to facilitate, or this topic keeps coming up, or people are approaching you as a network and you're having to navigate some tricky conversations, how do you do that? And what does finding common ground, what part does that play? Then I'm going to talk about lessons from history, because there are certain circumstances and situations that have come before, right? And this is the whole point of history. And sometimes we can learn from them in terms of how to navigate through those topics. Then I'm going to leave you with some action steps, so an actionable takeaway. And finally, some recommended resources as well that you can potentially go to. So let's just start by, I just want to start by acknowledging the complexity and the emotional weight behind this topic. I don't even think I can do it justice in terms of the complexity. And I know sometimes people sort of say it's simple, you know, it's really quite straightforward, and people sometimes talk about things like being on the right side of history and da 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 da. I disagree, right? I'm just going to put it out there. I disagree. And I think if it was simple, you wouldn't have so many people that are fearful of talking about it. There are other reasons that people are afraid of talking about it, which I will get into. But the reality is, even scholars of this topic, even, you know, scholars of like Middle Eastern conflicts and politics, and scholars around the history of Israel and Palestine and Gaza, etc., scholars are disagreeing, right, are in disagreement. And some people might say, well, that's because they've chosen a side, or that, well, it could be. But the reality is, if it was straightforward, everybody would be in agreement, right? So therefore it can't be. You may say it is, but it can't be. So there is a lot of complexity around this topic, and there is a lot of emotion in it as well. And I think some of the emotion actually, it comes from a few places. But first of all, I would start with the history. So I think the history of both the Palestinian and the Jewish people, in terms of people that have suffered extreme persecution and oppression over the years. I think, you know, when you add into that, so you add in, you know, years, decades, centuries of oppression, right? And you kind of like, you bring all of that into the mix. It's almost like all of the weight of that is kind of brought into what's been happening since October the 7th. So this recent conflict in this latest period. So there is a whole load of emotion that sits behind it, and then also you've got the severity of the events that led to here. So the severity of the attacks on October the 7th, and then the severity of the response, right, which obviously some people refer to as a genocide. And you've also got the severity of the situation prior to October the 7th, right? So you've got all of that in terms of these, just a constant, you know, oppression of these two groups of people, both in the region that they are in, but also in the wider world. And so you bring all of that into this situation, and that is a lot of emotion, right? It's a lot of, there's a lot of pain that's gone into it as well. So first of all, we need to recognize that individuals, regardless of what their political views are, whether they have views about who is or isn't, or was or wasn't in the wrong, we need to recognize that they're potentially coming from a place of pain and a place of a lot of emotion, which can actually make these conversations incredibly difficult, okay? The role of employee network leaders, in my mind, and this is something I talked about in my recent LinkedIn Live, which you can find here on the YouTube channel if you look under the lives. The role of employee network leaders is to provide support. It is also to be that place where people can come when they have a different view, and, you know, find that they're not necessarily just kind of cut down, you know, without having their voice heard, potentially. Now, this is a really difficult line to sort of walk, basically, because you may have a view as an employee network leader of what is right and wrong, and who is right and wrong. And there's nothing wrong with that, holding that view, and there's nothing wrong with that, with putting that view across. How do you do it in a way that it's done so respectfully that you still maintain connections with individuals that have a different view? Because that's going to be the reality of the organizations that you're in, right? The reality of those organizations is that, you know, if you have a side, or even if you don't have a side, there are going to be individuals in your organization that have taken a side. And so one of the challenges for you as a network leader is, how do you maintain almost like this like level of respect and this level of approachability, such that regardless of what side somebody has taken, they can still come and talk to you. And it's not easy, and it's a real skill, and it's a real art. And actually you may decide that, actually, do you know what, I'm going to set a boundary, and this is the level of support I'm going to give around this, or this is the level of this argument that I'm willing to listen to, and then I have to draw a boundary, and I will have a very polite way of letting people know that's my red line, like that's my red line, I can't accept that, and actually I'd prefer if we didn't maybe even have that conversation if you hold a particular view, because I know for some people it is literally this deep, right? So those are some of the things that you need to think about. What are the things that you can say if you potentially don't want to engage with somebody that holds a very, very different view? And for example, if you can see that the conversation is getting very heated. So having some phrases that work for you, you know, and it might just be, do you know what, today, for the sake of my mental health, or, you know, for the sake of our working relationship going forwards, I think we should probably park this conversation, right? So having those phrases that you're comfortable with, you know, practice those phrases, work on them so that you can kind of have them at a moment's notice, right? That's going to help you not be fearful of having these conversations if you've got those phrases ready to hand. If those conversations are coming up, in particular, if, for example, you lead a multicultural network, which I know many organisations in the UK in particular do, so multicultural, or it might be a race and ethnicity, or race and cultural heritage network. So you may actually have individuals who, you know, you may have individuals who are Jewish, say, for example, in that group. You may have individuals who are Arab, Muslim, and they, you know, you may have to navigate some difficult conversations where it feels like they're really at loggerheads, right? They're arguing, there's potential conflict in what should be a safe space. So what are some of the points of disagreement? Because I think the more we can understand those, the more we can support those individuals, because we know where they're coming from. And a lot of the time, the reason that some of these disagreements get heated often is because we feel that the other person doesn't understand our point of view. They don't understand where we're coming from. So my take on this is, if you as an employee network leader can do that, can kind of walk that line of understanding where the different sides are coming from, you'll actually find that you are creating a much safer space and you're more approachable. It's one of the things that I always try to do on LinkedIn. If you follow me on LinkedIn, you will know that I rarely get into arguments, right? And I rarely, it's not to say that I don't question anything, I do, but over the years, and I've been on LinkedIn for many years, active on LinkedIn, there's a way of asking questions and challenging and even disagreeing with somebody that doesn't switch people off. And that's kind of, around these kinds of topics, those are the sorts of skills that you need. And understanding the different points of disagreement can really help with that. So if we just sort of talk about them very briefly, I've got here 4 main points of disagreement. There will be many more, but I've got 4 main points. So first of all, the historical context. And I talked about that very briefly in the introduction to this. And so you may have individuals that have got very different views, even of the historical context, in terms of, you know, people's rights to the land, people's rights to have a homeland, right? That in and of itself. There's all of the historical context in terms of the you know, the role of other countries like Britain, and the role that Britain played in the separation of the land, right? So the historical context, people may even have disagreements about that. And some people might have the view of, you know, Jewish people absolutely have a right to have a physical home in the world where they can go to because of, you know, what happened in the Holocaust and all of those sorts of things. Then you may have other individuals that will be, well, absolutely, Palestinians have a right to X, Y, and Z. They were, you know, almost like turfed off of what effectively was their home, you know, in this, in what's sometimes referred to as the Nakba, right? So there's all of the historical context. And so because of that, you may get individuals just coming at this from completely different perspectives before you even get into what's happened since October the 7th. So for you as an employee network leader, understanding those points of disagreement is incredibly useful. If you're not sure where to find it, I mean, there is a wealth of education on this on YouTube at the moment, some really good scholars. My my advice to you would be to maybe find scholars and find sources that are well learned, well read, preferably academic, so you've probably got like some professors, etc., that are on there. And if possible, find some that are independent, as in neutral, so they don't have a view, they're kind of just telling you the history. This is something, around October the 7th, I did a lot of this, just delving into finding people that I thought, actually, they're just giving me a really good neutral take from both sides. And I think that's part of the reason that, I'm not going to say I've stayed neutral, because I do have a view, but it's helped me at least to navigate the space in a more neutral way, at least from, in terms of how I move and how I navigate and how I sort of talk to individuals around the topic. So understanding the historical context is really important, and it is a point of disagreement in terms of, rights to the land, etc., and all of those sorts of things. The second point of disagreement, I think, the legitimacy of the actions. So the legitimacy of the actions by Hamas on the 7th of October. Now you'll get, and you can, depending on which country you're in, you may have YouGov or other survey companies will have done, analysis on this in terms of what are the views of the majority. But certainly, say for example here in the UK, most people condemned the actions of Hamas on October the 7th. However, there are some people that are like, do you know what Hamas did, albeit even if the means were terrible, as in like beyond the pale, obviously, crimes, but some people will still say, well, it was justified because of the system that they were living under, for example, right? So the legitimacy of that action. And then in the same vein, the actions that Israel have now taken on the back of October the 7th in retaliation, you have some individuals that are saying, absolutely, they've gone too far. Like, what is going on? And then you have some that will say, look, this is war and it's justified in retaliation to that, and also to meet the aims of, we're not going to have that happening again on our doorstep. So there's something about this disagreement around the legitimacy of actions. I think that's actually a very difficult one to ever kind of like square away and get agreement on, because a lot of it is quite subjective, and it's kind of like wrapped into, what you believe has come before and who you kind of think is to blame. So the legitimacy of the actions is one that is incredibly difficult, and it kind of like leads on to the third one, which is again linked to the historical context. And before October the 7th, there will be those that had a view that, and I'll use the specific word, there'll be those that have a view that the system that Israel was really kind of like running under was effectively an apartheid, and that the Palestinians were basically living under an incredibly repressive and oppressive regime, right? So some people have that view in terms of the legitimacy of, for example, October the 7th, even if they don't necessarily agree with all of the means on October the 7th, they maybe agree with the end objective. And then they may also then use the term genocide, and there's been a lot of debate around, is this a genocide, is it not a genocide? I think the reality is there are many more organisations now. This is just fact. This is not necessarily taking a side, but there are many more organisations, first of all, even before October the 7th, that did say that there were many similarities between Israel and South African apartheid system, right? And some organisations that out and out just said it is an apartheid. I think I'm right in saying that I think Amnesty International was one, and maybe Human Rights Watch, I want to say, but I'll correct that in the description if I've got those wrong. But I'm fairly sure that way before October the 7th, they were saying it's like an apartheid state. And then in terms of genocide, again, many organisations have come out and said, okay, since October 7th, the actions that Israel are taking, the nature of them is, war crimes most certainly, and potentially genocide. And some organisations again have come out and categorically said this is a genocide, but still that is a point of disagreement, you know. And you will get people certainly who sort of take the side of Israel and will say it's not genocide, there is a war going on, and you know, we have these civilian casualties which are collateral damage of the war. So that's where you get a massive, I think, source of disagreement at the moment. I think it's really interesting. So I'm recording this on August the 18th, and over the weekend there have been even more protests in Israel, and there've been protests in Israel for a long time, but we don't often see a lot of the news. But even in Israel, you know, more and more protests about the war, not least because you know, they want hostages returned safe and secure, but also now some of the protests around, you know, we are not happy with the level of the human disaster in Gaza. You know, we don't want that on our conscience. So that's another reason for a point of disagreement in terms of, you know, is the extent of the action that's been taken, can it be justified? And then the final disagreement that I want to just pull out here is around the extent to which the media coverage is true or not, and the extent to which it's propaganda. And I have no answers for this, but all I will say is, and this is something to be aware of, so when people are talking about what's going on, what they've seen, etc., I'm always a big fan of, you know, try to find the most independent, credible sources you can. Those are not always to be found on social media, right? And I'm conscious that I'm putting this on a platform which is effectively social media, but the reality is, you know, both sides in this conflict have been proven to use misinformation and disinformation and propaganda. So there is, because of that, because of the role of the media, etc., and the role of you know, Hamas and the Israeli government and the IDF, etc., in terms of you know, propaganda and all of that stuff, it's kind of just a big whole mess, but it really is fueling the disagreement. So, you know, as an employee network leader, I think being mindful of that, and when conversations happen and people start to talk about things that they've seen on social media, I would maybe, you know, if you can, sort of say, if we are going to sort of like discuss and debate, you know, can we maybe just only use reliable, credible, reputable sources wherever possible? Because otherwise it's just the wild, wild west. If people are going to be literally taking everything that they see on social media as fact, you know, we could just all make up a reality that just only lives on Instagram and Facebook, right? In terms of finding common ground, so if you have individuals, for example, especially if you literally have one network, you have individuals all in the same network, or in, you know, or for example in a network like a Jewish network or a Muslim network or an Arab network where there is disagreement over this, right? What common ground can you find in that? Now, the one thing that I always say is sometimes when you look at things like, well, what is the aim or what is the objective? That's often where you can find common ground. You know, what would a good objective or a good outcome be? So many people are comfortable to say, do you know what, a good outcome would be an end to this conflict, an end to this conflict, and stop like all of the bloodshed, all of the killing, etc. So that first of all is the first piece of common ground. People then maybe disagree on the how, but the first one is, you know, can we get that? Then you may find that there is more common ground around things like, well, what does that end look like? You know, so if you were to kind of like go another level in terms of what does that end look like? You know, does it look like a two-state solution? Does it look like something else? You'd be surprised at how much common ground you can find by starting with almost like an end goal that everybody kind of agrees with, that's a good outcome, you know, the return of the hostages, If you can get agreement around that and then sort of say, well, what would that look like? You may well find that you can then get common agreement about the next thing, and then maybe the next thing, and then the next thing, and then, you know, the beauty of common ground is that that's how you start to build bridges between individuals where maybe there is some friction and some conflict. So that's one thing I would say, really look for common ground. One of the ways that you can do that is by some serious listening. So this is one of the skills, and, you know, as an employee network leader, obviously listening is a key skill anyway. But enabling your others, your network members, or if you're holding a listening session for the wider community and wider colleagues, helping them to be able to listen well and listen actively is a real skill. And I put it, when I did the LinkedIn Live, you maybe will have seen it in the description, but I talked there about asking questions. So, getting each side to ask each other questions, or you asking questions as a network leader of individuals whose point of view you perhaps don't align with. And then when they answer, feeding, replaying the answer back to them. So saying, this is what I think I've heard, and replaying it back to them. When you do that, so basically when you stop trying to think of the next thing you're going to say in your mind, and you're actually just actively listening and playing it back, you're more likely to take it in and to understand where it is that they're coming from. And that is the key. You're trying to get each side to understand where they're coming from, to potentially create some empathy within the group, and to kind of keep those relationships going, because these are working relationships, right? So you're trying to at least keep those relationships going, and maybe some empathy so that you can actually support each other on an emotional level as well. So the listening thing is really, really important. And just remembering that these are tricky topics, right? And they're incredibly nuanced. In terms of resources, there's one resource that I'm going to be recommending at the end of each of these videos, right? And that is the book, The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. It's by the brilliant author Jonathan Haidt, spelt Haidt, I think, The Righteous Mind. That is one book. I think if you're an employee network leader, you need to read that book anyway. So that's one book I would recommend. And then another book actually that I have been listening to on Audible is Uncomfortable Conversations with a Jew. Another great book you could try is The 100 Years War on Palestine, if you want to get the Palestinian viewpoint as well. There's also that book by Ta-Nehisi Coates. It's a little bit controversial, so you may or may not want to read that. But again, this is about understanding the other person's perspective, because one of the biggest issues when it comes to conflicts, particularly around politics, is we tend to have confirmation bias, right? What is confirmation bias? Confirmation bias is when we only look for things that support views that we already hold, and we tend to screen out everything that doesn't align with what we believe. And that's part of the problem with the world, right? Is the reality of it. So I hope this has been useful. I know I couldn't go through everything, and I've already been talking for way longer than I wanted to for this video. So yeah, I hope that was useful. If you are struggling with these kinds of conversations, please do reach out to me. Drop me an email or send me a DM, etc. And we can jump on a call, and I will just listen to what you have to say and see how I can help in your situation and maybe give you some more practical examples. That is it. Go with grace, my friends. This is not an easy topic. Take care.